Hello, Canada and hockey fans in the United States and Newfoundland.
He said he was going to give Parliament the right to a free vote. And then he explained what he meant by a free vote, that you're going to be allowed to vote. But if you vote against him...
At any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Just watch me.
But listen, you kid, don't get caught in the Canadian syndrome, where if it's Canadian, it's got to be bad. We're the best. I've been telling you the best.
There are more of us than ever before. But it's always a question of quality as against quantity in this life.
Welcome to the first episode of the podcast of the Red Ensign. This podcast is concerned with Canada as a people, and not Canada as a post-national state. Now, before beginning the podcast proper, and the podcast will typically be co-hosted and include many guests, but before we begin that set of content, I wanted to do a review to tell the story of Canada as a people and Canada as a story of elites competing in political history. So as we go through this podcast, we'll be reviewing Canada through the lens of Italian elite theory and through the lens of a kind of realist conception of politics. But in order to do that properly, we have to have an audience which is properly informed about the history of Canada through that perspective. And so I'm going to take this initial episode, almost an episode 0.5, a primer before we begin, to review the history of Canada through the lens of elite theory. All right, the place to begin when looking at the history of Canada is to begin with the settlement of Canada. The settlement of Canada began with the settlement of French Canada, beginning in the 1650s, but getting serious through the 18th century. And the first set of settlement came in sort of three segments, centered at Fort Quebec, up the St. Lawrence Basin through the Great Lakes region, and northwest towards Manitoba and the lakes that way, and then down south through the Mississippi Valley. The Mississippi Valley settlements become much less significant after the Louisiana Purchase and the American Revolution, but they're very significant in the early history of Canada. In that world, you had a French-Canadian population with two elite components. A clerical elite responsible for kind of the social part of French-Canadian life, and an imperial elite who had sort of political dominance of the colony. However, in 1753, when Quebec was conquered by Wolfe at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, the French Canada was decapitated of its political elite and left with an Anglo-Imperial elite and French-Canadian Catholic clerical elite that was kind of subservient to the political elite of the new colony. Now, very shortly thereafter, the American Revolution happened. The Loyalists were ejected from the American colonies, in many cases quite violently so. The British Crown was concerned about the suffering of the Loyalists. Many of them were quite violently driven off their land, and as a reward for their loyalty to the Crown, decided to resettle them in the unsettled land in the Canadian colony. They purchased a large tract of land along the north shore of Lake Ontario, the north side of the St. Lawrence River, and the north side of Lake Erie, and created a colony called Upper Canada. And this is kind of the beginning of English Canada. And so you end up now with Canada with kind of three factions: a British Imperial elite that oversees both colonies, a subservient clerical elite in French Canada, and a subservient business elite in Upper Canada that kind of derived their wealth primarily from agriculture at this time. Now, after 1780, we enter into really beginning after the War of 1812, we enter into the Long Imperial Peace, during which Canada, the settlement of Canada continues rapidly. A large number of additional migrants from the United Kingdom come and populate Upper Canada, and Upper Canada is industrialized. All through this period, there's a high tariff border between Canada and the United States that encourages the development of domestic industry. And for the first segment of this period, there is a set of trade policies in the British Empire called the Imperial Preference that facilitate the timber industry, the shipbuilding industry, and the agricultural industry shipping out the St. Lawrence River across the Atlantic Ocean to the United Kingdom. Goods which otherwise would have been much more expensive than agricultural and timber goods coming from places like Russia or France came instead from Canada because of the imperial preference. And it created this it created the economic foundation on which Upper Canada was built. And so during this period, the Upper Canadian business elite grow immensely in power because of the industrial development of the country, but still they're kind of dominated by the imperialist elite who derived their justification from the British Empire, the benefits of being part of the British Empire, and by their sort of military connection to the British Empire. These are people like, during this period, you've got kind of this dialectic in English Canada. On the one hand, you've got Donald Alexander Smith, later the Lord Strathcona, who is kind of the embodiment of the imperialist elite, who view their building of Canada as an extension of the building of the British Empire. Alexander Smith was born in Scotland and viewed his forwarding of Canada as an explicitly kind of imperialist project. He both enriched himself immensely during the building of the railways in the West, but he also viewed it as the construction of a permanent British possession in the west of North America that would be, and viewed the railway as an essential component in making sure that it would be that the Americans wouldn't come and grab the Western Territory. And on the other side of this dialectic, you see George Brown, representative of the Clear Grits. These are the non-imperial industrial interests in Canada, and at this time, they're very interested in politics within the kind of local colonial government of Canada, and they're trying to kind of advance their interests in that government. These are the people who think that in 1867 they're building a country, whereas Lord Strathcona thinks he's reorganizing a colony of the British Empire under a more suitable governance structure. This elite dialectic comes apart as a result of Canada's participation in the Great War. So Canada participated enthusiastically in the First World War. A huge number of Canadians signed up, were shipped to Europe and fought in the trenches, and a huge number of Canadians died. To give a kind of perspective on this, there was something like, on a per capita basis, Canada had something like half the level of casualties of France in the First World War, and something like 10 times the level of casualties of the US. So not quite the same kind of devastation you saw with the European participants. The territory in Canada was obviously not ruined, and not nearly as many people died. But it's not like the United States. It's not a footnote in the social history of the country. In two ways. First, the mass casualties of Canadian young men delegitimized the rule of the Imperial faction of the elite. And second, the near bankruptcy of the British Empire as a result of the war completely destroyed the imperialist kind of patronage network that supported that elite in Canadian politics. And that twofold action began the long period of complete dominance of Canadian politics by what are now known as the Laurentian elite. During this period, you had many of the many people who were part of the former imperial elite get cut off from that patronage network and join forces with the local business elite in Canada to form this new bloc. And it kicks off a period of almost 100 years where Canada is ruled by a united elite with kind of total political control of the country. During this period, what I've labeled the Laurentian unity, best embodied in William Lyon Mackenzie King, who was prime minister for like almost 30 years during both the First and Second World War and through large segments of the Depression. Canada was developed as if it was the property of the Laurentian elite in perpetuity, with a kind of long foresight about the development of the value of the property. And there were two big projects that this elite had in the period from the end of from the turn of the 20th century through to the Second World War. The first was the settlement of the West. So you can see here I've included a poster from a propaganda campaign to drive migrants from Europe, which labeled Western Canada the last best West and portrayed it as a paradise in which you could get free land and grow crops. That was a little bit ambitious. Most of the settlers that went out there failed as farmers. Western Canada is a very, very harsh climate, very, very difficult to farm, especially before mechanization and central heating. Just a very, very difficult place to live. But that was kind of one of their key projects, and their other key project was the exploitation of the French Canadian population. So you see figures like Maurice Duplessis during this period, who run French Canadian government as kind of a racket for the Anglo business elite that dominate Montreal and Quebec City at this time. So you have a kind of subordinate clerical elite, but the politics of Quebec is very much controlled at this time for the benefit of this kind of Anglo-Canadian layer that sits on top of the politics of the country at the time. After the Second World War, the control of Canadian politics was briefly disrupted by the collapse of the British Empire. And you have this very unusual political opportunity that I've labeled the Diefenbaker insurgency. John Diefenbaker was a populist that drew on the old imperialist elite on the one hand, and what had grown to be a very, very large military-industrial patronage network that existed during the Second World War, during which time nearly 80% of the spending of the government of Canada was dedicated to the military. And so Diefenbaker leads this insurgency. to try to remake Canada in the sort of post-British Empire period as a Commonwealth country with a very British identity and a sort of classically Anglo martial society led from the military. The intent here is to kind of be the foremost soldiers in the Cold War. He does all kinds of interesting things during this period. One of the most famous projects during this period is the Diefenbaker. So Canada has this strategic headquarters designed to withstand multiple direct hits from a nuclear bomb, as if Canada is going to be a key combatant in the Cold War. So that's kind of the vision of Canada that Diefenbaker launches on the back of this kind of very populist, rhetoric to try to attach to the sort of martial elite. This insurgency causes a crisis and reaction from the Laurentian elite, who realize that without the British Empire, their position is vulnerable. And so they go and they find new patrons in the United States, which at this time is being very solidly run in sort of the post-war FDR autopilot government. And they engage in a project which is broadly known by historians as the Invention of Canada. The best way to understand this is to look at it as the colonial transfer of Canada from a vassal state of the British Empire to a vassal state of Blue America. And probably the best symbolic way to understand this is through the changing of the flag from the red ensign to the modern maple leaf flag, and the changing of the national anthem from the Maple Leaf Forever to O Canada. And to kind of drive this point home, I'm going to quote the first verse of the Maple Leaf Forever to kind of understand the old vision of Canada as in contrast to the post-war invention of Canada vision. In days of yore from Britain's shore, Wolfe the dauntless hero came, and planted firm Britannia's flag on Canada's fair domain. Here may it wave, our boast, our pride, and joined in love together, the thistle, shamrock, rose, and twine, the maple leaf forever. So you can see this older vision of Canada is explicitly Anglo, explicitly based on the political justification of having conquered the country, explicitly based on the union of three ethnicities that formed the core of the British Empire: the Irish, the Scottish, the thistle for Scotland, the shamrock for Ireland, the rose for England, entwined the maple leaf forever. This in contrast to the sort of to the new national anthem, O Canada, which celebrates Canada as a kind of propositional nation. So this goes on until the poor governance of Trudeau Sr. creates fractures in the previously unified Laurentian elite. So both of these fractures occur in the 70s. Both of them are directly attributable to the mismanagement of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. The first of these elite fractures, well, I shouldn't say they're both attributable directly to Trudeau's management, but they both get their purchase because Trudeau fails to reconsolidate the elite. So the first of these grievances comes from French Canada. So beginning during the First World War, as a consequence of the immense exploitation of the country in order to help the British Empire wage that war, there is kind of deep resentment of imperial rule in Quebec. This probably the most famous expression of this resentment is the conscription riots in Quebec in 1917, during which the government of Canada open fire with machine guns into a crowd. And so as a consequence of that level of exploitation during the First World War and to a lesser degree during the Second World War, a self-conscious French-Canadian elite began to form in the 30s, and they formed in radical left-wing circles. And so you got these intellectuals that circulated from between sort of 1930 and 1960 in Quebec among the left, protected because in the period right-wing extremist politics becomes increasingly illegal, but left-wing, because of the influence of the U.S., left-wing extremist politics gradually becomes kind of winked and nodded at by the authorities. And so by 1960, you have a mature counter-elite in Quebec that seizes power through a combination of an electoral strategy and a kind of radical arm with the FLQ. So you've got René Lévesque, who founds the Parti Québécois, an explicitly Quebec nationalist party. They get a party both at the provincial level and at the national level predicated on defending Quebec as a sovereign nation. The radical arm in the FLQ engages in acts of terrorism, kidnaps an MP, incites Pierre Trudeau to declare martial law and invoke the War Measures Act, and Trudeau fails to crush the elite, the insurgency, and ends up having to compromise with the French-Canadian elite, giving them a permanent position in Quebec politics, and a position that they would only grow in the future, to the point where in the 90s and then potentially again in the future, they brought referendums for formal separation and the formation of a permanent state. So that's kind of one fracture. First incited by the heavy exploitation of French Canada, later inflamed by this not very elegant handling of the French Canadian elite. And this is something that this podcast will have to address in a much greater degree of detail as we progress. The other major fracture was directly incited by Pierre Elliott Trudeau and his effort to his economic nationalist efforts to kind of convert Canada into a socialist state on the kind of Venezuelan oil model. And so Trudeau brought forward a policy called the National Energy Policy to try to nationalize Canada's oil resources, particularly in Western Canada. This effort, because this effort failed, so the assets were not fully nationalized and were eventually resold to Western Canadian business interests, the memory of this failed effort at nationalization created a permanent rift between Western Canada and the Laurentian elite, and a permanent rift that had a class of very well-funded elites at the front of it. You can see here, I've in the slide, I've labeled this. I've invoked this via the book "Let the Eastern Bastards Freeze in the Dark," which was a popular political slogan in Western Canada in the 70s and 80s, and continues to have kind of a sort of spiritual power in modern Alberta politics. Even with these fractures kind of in the back, the Laurentians retained control of the country and became more and more abusive and less and less competent in their management of the country. Beginning in the 80s, they engaged in a program of replacement level migration to the country, So Canada had two really large waves of migration before this: a wave of British migration in the 19th century, and then sort of two smaller waves of European migration. One in the early 20th century, and then another immediately following the Second World War. But the third, and probably very likely to be largest wave of Canadian migration occurred beginning in the 1980s, and was initially quote unquote meritocratic, based on a point system. This meritocratic system privileged English-speaking migrants from the former British Empire. The unexpected consequence of that was that a vast number of migrants from the Indian subcontinent and from Hong Kong and later related areas of China poured into the country. So that's kind of one piece of it. And then the other piece of their mismanagement of Canada is on the economic side, where the kind of economic nationalism of Pierre Trudeau, and then later the poor management of Canada's economy in the post 1990. Well, Canada goes effectively bankrupt in the early 90s, and it really impairs the economic prospects of the country. And so Canadians go from, in the mid-century, being comparably wealthy to their American neighbors to, by the 80s, substantially poorer. By 2020, very, very, very noticeably poorer than their American neighbors. This is very difficult to hide because most Canadians live within a couple hours drive of the US and regularly travel there. And so they're constantly reminded that as a direct consequence of the policies of the Laurentian elite and their approach, they're enormously poorer than their neighbors. And so you end up with this kind of regional politics based on these elites. You have the great castle of the Western elite in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and to a lesser extent Manitoba. You have the two great castles of the Laurentian elite in the city of Toronto and in the city of Montreal. You have Blue Ontario, which is kind of all of rural Ontario, which is kind of orphaned, but hates the Laurentian elite, so they side with Western Canada. And you have non-Montreal Quebec, which is aligned with the Quebecois elite, and tend to support the Parti Québécois and the sort of Franco-nationalist elite. And these become enduring rifts in Canadian politics. In the 1980s, a reimagining of the American empire occurs, beginning under Ronald Reagan. The American empire, from 1945 to 1980, is a kind of is a project that looks a lot like the FDR government and thinks in terms of economic nationalism, resource industrial policy, and does not privilege global trade. From 1980 forward, the American empire transforms itself into an empire built on global trade and breaking down national barriers, national identities. And you can see that this comes to Canadian politics in the 1988 election debate, where Brian Mulroney, who is the conservative candidate, is accused of lack of patriotism for his support of NAFTA, and ends up winning the election decisively, and carries a mandate to end the long-standing Laurentian policy of tariffs to protect their interests in Canadian industry. And so you end up, after an interlude during the kind of high period of the American Empire from 1990 to 2010, you end up with two competing attempts to reconceptualize Canada after the fall of the Laurentians' industrial might that kind of drove their wealth. You have first the attempted globalist reinvention of Canada. This is Justin Trudeau and his post-national state. This vision of the future is predicated on selling Canadian real estate as a kind of housing development for the global South. So that's kind of the source of wealth. The other source of wealth is the international banking network. And then, and so that's kind of the one half of the attempt to reinvent Canada. And this attempt this attempt comes into contact with its contradictions during the 2022 truck protests, which are, on their surface, a direct response to COVID policies, but as you kind of explore them more deeply, have a broad resonance looking across the various ways in which the Laurentian globalist attempt to reinvent Canada was failing. It's no coincidence that Maxime Bernier, the leader of the People's Party of Canada, is down there hand in hand with the protesters and is the only Canadian politician to stand against mass migration as a policy. The truck protests, the subsequent anti-Trudeau movement has legs long after COVID ends because of broad discontent with this vision to tear up old Canada in an effort to enrich the Laurentian elite to keep them in power in a new paradigm. The Western elite come up with a different plan. So the Laurentian elite, their plan is be on Team Globalist and harvest the sources of revenue associated with Team Globalist to perpetuate their rule and try to reconsolidate Canada under their power. That plan largely failed because there isn't enough power and wealth in the globalist network to do that, especially when the other elite networks that have already broken off the Laurentians have such robust sources of wealth and political power. Now, the Western elite have their own plan in the period between sort of 2001 and 2024, have their own plan for how to remake Canada, reinvention of Canada 2.0. And their plan is based on an alliance between the Western elite and Team Red in U.S. politics. It looks at the Bush administration, it looks at the first Trump administration, and sees a potential set of political allies. It's very enthusiastic for the war on terror. It's very enthusiastic for economic integration with the United States. Remember, the Western elite have their economic base in selling Canada's natural resources and agricultural goods primarily to the United States. And so it's very natural for them to want to marry up that source of wealth with a source of political power and legitimacy. This effort to reinvent Canada in alignment with Red America totally is in crisis at the moment because of the imposition of tariffs on Canada from Donald Trump and the threat of additional tariffs on Canada from Donald Trump. So the Western elite who kind of have this vision source their wealth primarily from exports to the United States. So not only does the imposition of tariffs on Canada by the Trump administration threaten their economic interests, but also it stirs up the kind of nationalist vigor for the previous iteration of Canadian nationalism, which is the ironically is reinvention of Canada 1.0 as done by the Laurentian elite. And so you see lib nationalism all over the country at the moment, in contrast to this kind of vision. So it's really broken the plans of the Western elite, and it's not clear yet how they're going to respond to it. And so we find ourselves in the current political moment, a total leadership vacuum. The Laurentian elite, which have governed the country for so long, are bankrupt morally. They have no vision of themselves or what a good future would be. They've attached themselves to replacement migration, to technocratic programs like medical assistance in dying, like safe injection sites, like anti-policing. And by attaching themselves to these ideas, they've kind of self-evanesced. These ideas are not generationally stable, and so as you move from one generation of the Laurentian elite to the next, the degeneration is palpable. Justin Trudeau is a pale shadow of his father, Pierre Trudeau, but the generation which follows Justin Trudeau aren't fit even to carry Justin Trudeau's boots, which is a profound insult, to say the least. But the Laurentian globalist political formula for Canada's future may have failed, but their competitors, the Western elite, have also failed to deliver a viable political formula to govern the country. And the Quebec elite have a political formula which is kind of predicated on a kind of ethnic nationalism that doesn't work outside Quebec. And so we have this political vacuum in Canada that is profound and hanging in the air. No one can think of a reason why Canada should exist. Nobody can think of a reason. Nobody can think of a positive future for the country. There's no. The people languish for a lack of vision. And so this is the moment in which the Red Ensign podcast comes into being. We'll discuss Canada's history, Canada's culture, this political moment, and we hope to be a part of writing a new and better future on the blank canvas that exists right now for Canada's political future. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I hope to speak to you again soon.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.